Just read The Tempest by Shakespeare. Thus, allegedly, Beethoven answered Anton Schindler, his part-time secretary, when Schindler asked Beethoven for a key to this sonata in D minor, number 17. And then the nickname Tempest stuck with the music ever since. There are two problems with this story though. One is that, according to Schindler himself, this answer, just go read The Tempest, was given not only regarding this sonata, but also regarding the Appassionata. So the Appassionata might have been with just as much justification called The Tempest. But at the time, the Appassionata was already known as the Appassionata and had no place for a second nickname, and therefore the nickname had only stuck with the sonata in D minor. But the second problem, perhaps the bigger one, is that we know that Schindler was a liar and a fabricator. Many of the conversations he alleged to have had with Beethoven were actually his own entries many years after Beethoven's death. This we know from research carried into the conversation books by Beethoven in the 1970s and 1970s, ink analysis, paper analysis, handwriting analysis. So, with him having been the foremost authority on Beethoven in the years after Beethoven's death, and now being proven as a falsifier, it is very hard to know for sure whether anything he said is actually true. It could be that Beethoven said that, and it could be that this was a story invented by him, because he had an agenda in other places too. He wanted to show that Beethoven had a preconceived idea or story about the music, and therefore wrote the music according to that story. So this was something which he tried to prove throughout several conversations, this being one of them. So maybe it was an invention to help support his thesis. We do not know. But I think if the music had not stirred something in the imagination of the listener, which also corresponded to the images brought about by the Tempest and the magical world which Shakespeare created in that play, the nickname would not have stuck. So whether or not it comes from Beethoven perhaps is less important, but the fact is that everybody feels that there is something highly imaginative in this music. And this starts from the very opening. This opening is an invitation to a different world. Whether magical or not, we do not know yet. This is clearly a signal saying something different will happen now. You will be transported somewhere else. And it is Beethoven's magic that he could take something so mundane as a broken chord, and not just any broken chord, but a very specific chord. This chord, the so-called 6-3 chord, was a chord used in operas before the beginning of a recitativo. And the nickname of this chord is the cembalist chord, because these chords were often played by the harpsichord player accompanying the singers, or by the conductor accompanying the singers from the harpsichord. We hear it in Mozart's operas and many others from the time. So audiences would have a clear association of this chord with opera, and thus with theater, and thus with narrative. But the commonplace nature of this chord is completely transformed by Beethoven into something magical and unusual. And he does it by instructing us to play it pianissimo and very slowly, largo. If you compare it with the first is magical and full of imagination, the second is just a broken chord. And it is the same idea of Beethoven's own magic which transforms the opening of the Appassionata, perhaps the Tempest as it should have been called, from a broken F minor chord into a moment of tense expectation and menace lurking in the music. So the same idea, Beethoven taking empty material and transforming it into evocative narrative magic. The moves, of course, are different. In the Sonata, as I mentioned, it is rather a menacing chord crawling from the bottom part of the keyboard, whereas in the Tempest it is more of a feeling of expectation of something possibly magical to come. But the reason I'm getting so stuck on this first chord is that it will later lead to perhaps the most magical moment in the entire sonata, and definitely in the first moment. I mentioned that this is the Recitativo opening chord, but at the beginning we do not get a Recitativo. I will immediately show what we do get, but a Recitativo does come later when this opening chord is repeated at the beginning of the reprise. And this is one of the most magical soundscapes which Beethoven has written. A highly expressive, personal saying, musical saying, all bathed in a single pedal. He instructs us not to leave the pedal throughout, thus clouding the harmonies and creating something which, with the addition of the whole, helping the reverberation, can give an unforgettable musical experience. It is always like this with Beethoven. If he introduces any kind of idea, this time a broken chord, it immediately becomes a motive for him. A motive could be also a melody. A motive could be a rhythmical group. A motive could be a key. A motive could be a modulation, a rhythm. In this case, a broken chord. And the idea with a motive would be that he would develop it. It's not just that, oh, I had some amazing inspiration, here is a phrase, and then we move somewhere else. Once he's planted this seed, in this case a broken chord, he will repeat it. And not only throughout the movement, in the beginning of the sonata, at the beginning of the repeat of the exposition, at the transition from the exposition to the development, where he repeats it 3 times. Once again, this cloud of sound. So thus delineating all the clear sections of the movement, but on top of that, he will use the broken chord as the main material of the fast part of the movement. So transforming, of course, from something soft and gentle into something stormy and intense, but clearly drawing from the same musical DNA of a broken chord going upwards. And on top of that, the beginning of the second movement will start with a broken chord, thus also linking the 2 movements together. But before we get to this material, I should go back to the opening, because there, after the first broken chord, we do not get a recitativo. We might have been expecting it, but our expectations in this case would have been upset. Instead, we get a sighing motive. But whereas the recitativo chord was supposed to be played fast and is written slowly by Beethoven, this sighing motive, especially in the Baroque, was often used as a slow motive to accentuate the sighing element of it. Whereas here it is fast, it's panting, it's hyperventilating. Then the recitativo chord again. And he continues developing the sighing motive. now it will be a very dramatic descent, all based on these couplets. Beethoven's usual insistence on a motive. And only here we launch into the movement proper. I hope I'm not exaggerating if I say that, in my opinion, this is the most imaginative and unusual movement opening that Beethoven has ever written in a sonata. We have other sonatas with introductions, like the Pathétique or his last sonata, number 32. We have sonatas that start with short sentences outside the tempo, like sonata number 24, F sharp major, or the sonata number 31. But in this case, this seamless integration of theater and theatricality, a slow broken chord, then a fast tempo, then going immediately slow, and then fast again. This is so unusual and so outside the usual way of thinking of a sonata as a architecturally unified piece. Here he throws this unification out of the window in order to create atmosphere, in order to create a narrative, in order to grip us in a different way, and it works in a tremendous fashion. To maintain the tense mood of the first movement, he doesn't grant us a second subject which would be lighter or contrasting with the turbulence of this, but rather the second subject is based on the same hyperventilating motive. It is as if he wants the only moment of slow or not turbulent music to be the recitative chords. He wants us to yearn for a bit of stability in the recitative chords, and then this would make the effect of the recitative, when it finally appears, that much stronger, because all the rest was just turbulence without respite. The development, in the same way, is all fortissimo and turbulent. There is a very great strength in this unity of mood. It is the same thing he did in the Moonlight, both in the first and in the third movement. There is no major key anywhere, and this is almost what he did in the Appassionata. There are moments there of a major key, but they are very short-lived, and then he goes back to this unremitting darkness. And after the development, this is where we have our magical moment of recitativo. So I said that here he makes the promise come true of the recitativo, but we could also argue that by this point we're not expecting a recitativo anymore, because we had these chords twice in the exposition, twice in the repeat of the exposition, and 3 times in the development. Thus 7 times. All of them were supposed to be chords before a recitativo, and none of them were. So perhaps by this time we're not expecting a recitativo at all anymore, if we are listeners who are hearing this music for the first time. So in a way, maybe the recitativo, when it comes, is just as much an upset expectation as the lack of recitativo was in the beginning. Once again, Beethoven is such an amazing judge of the psychological effect his music has on listeners. His music throughout his life was always conceived with the listener in mind. You can hear it from the special effects he employs, you can hear it from the humorous phrase he writes in other sonatas. He wants it to be heard. This was not supposed to be music just to leave on paper or played for yourself. This was music that was supposed to be performed. Which makes slightly interesting the fact that none of his sonatas, apart from one, has ever been performed in a public concert during his life. All of them were performed only for small circles of connoisseurs, of friends in musical salons. It was only Sonata number 28. Excuse me for playing it without a pedal, which was once played before a wider audience. So the sonatas in a way became his laboratory of ideas. If you compare any sonata with any concerto written at the same time, the sonatas will invariably be more adventurous, often more revolutionary. So back to the Recitativo. Here, finally, we get it. And then he writes con espressione e semplice, to be played with expression but simply. It is as if he did not want it to be exaggerated theatrical emotion, but honest, sincere, deep emotion coming from your heart, coming from your core. And then, of course, this absolute magic of a single pedal. We know that the sound decay on Beethoven's pianos was a lot faster than on ours. So perhaps the cloud of sound created by this single pedal wasn't as thick or dense at the time, but for surely it was still existent. And we know that here, for example, when we have our second recitativo, that this clash would have been just as jarring as it is for our ears. So he definitely wanted to create the clash of the recitativo, which moves, it must because it's a spoken phrase, and the static chord, immovable and just held there, imaginably by strings. They're just holding this chord. We have these held chords in recitativos by Bach, in the Passions, and they always, for example, when in the Passion according to St. Matthew, every time Jesus speaks, there is a halo of sound created by the strings holding the chord. And I do not want to imply that Beethoven wanted to make this kind of connection with this music, but this oral image of a halo or a support of sound throughout a recitativo definitely was something that the listeners knew. And here Beethoven employs it in a new and unusual and a striking way by mixing the two things on the same instrument, thus creating one of the most imaginative and unforgettable soundscapes which he's ever written. And then from there, to move back to the reprise, he writes once again a very imaginative narrative passage, like clocks striking in a distance. It is once again theater with the highest expressive power, the greatest strength of grabbing us and not letting go, the tension which he manages to build through these chords. This is, by the way, the same chord, the same 6/3 chord, just repeated and short. It pulsates with hardly held back energy. And then, after the reprise, we have a short coda to close this chapter of the narrative. Once again, a held chord and some kind of tumult or turbulence in the left hand. Once again, the atmosphere is restless. The atmosphere is one that cannot settle down, and the overall impression of this movement is dark, troubled, and troubling in a way, but definitely magical through the broken chord and the recitative. But then, after this dark first movement, Beethoven, being as ever a superb judge of how much the audience can take, he gives us a moment of true respite in the second movement, exactly like he does in the appassionata. If the appassionata is a theme with variations, here we will have a different structure. It also starts with our broken chord, but immediately he introduces the high register. There is a feeling of striving upwards and attaining these heights quite easily, whereas the first movement always had to climb arduously upwards, and once these heights were reached, then it would be a cascade of sound downwards. Here, this sense of effortless floating prevails. And then later, even higher. There is a stately elegance to this music, a very slow pace. It's written in adagio, but a sense of ease and tranquility. But this being the sonata that it is, even here Beethoven does not let the shadow pass completely. From bar 17, we have a distant menace of drums. The right hand plays a very, once again, stately, legato, drone motive. But then it immediately clashes with these sharp and precise drums in the left hand. And then later, the left hand will play once below, once above the right hand. If this is drums, then this perhaps could be a fanfare of trumpets. But you would probably agree that this music is not relaxed at all. And if the right hand on its own could have been relaxed, this clear rhythmical ta-da-da-dam doesn't allow it to be. It keeps it held and keeps us also a little bit on the edge of our seats. Beethoven then does give us a short motive of respite. Some kind of courtly dance, but the length of this respite is no more than 6 or 7 bars, and then we have our drums once again. And this time even the right hand is tense. We go immediately into a reprise. There is no development. We had 3 sections: the opening section, the section with the drums, and then the section of this dance or stately song whatever you feel it is. And after these 3 sections have been played, he will repeat all of them with variations. There is no development. This time, the first section introduces a slightly more painful color. As if the shadow which we had felt before now even comes into the previously clear passage of the opening. And then he writes what is one of the most beautiful moments of the movement, but at the same time one of the most intensely uncomfortable from a pianistic point of view. He writes a variation on this opening, and while the right hand covers the main motive, the left hand plays a shimmering filigree of demi-semi-quavers. It sounds beautiful together. But it is, as I said, intensely unpianistic. It is as if he had a very clear musical image in his mind, this gentle cascade of notes swirling around the theme, above it when the theme is in the low register, below it when the theme is in the upper register, seamlessly crossing the 2 voices. And he just wrote it down, and he did not give a care about how the pianists were supposed to play it. We have the famous anecdote that when the violinist giving the premiere of the violin concerto complained to Beethoven that the concerto was highly un-violinistic, unidiomatic in its writing, and Beethoven allegedly replied quite grumpily or angrily, "Do you think that when the muse lands on me, I would be thinking of your petty violin?" And the same kind of disregard of any technical challenges, it can be felt here. And of course, for the audience, this should not matter at all. It is just a beautiful and imaginative soundscape to complement the various imaginative soundscapes which we have in this sonata. And then we have also a variation on the motive with the drums. And then in the end, after all of it, a coda. Ending it slightly uneasily, these harmonies, and also ending it on the weakest part of the beat. 1, 2, 3, end. So on the 6th note out of 6. And I have to say that taken in its entirety, this movement has a curious effect, at least on me while playing. It is supposed to be a moment of respite, and yet the way that Beethoven cannot seem to leave the home key of B flat major. Anytime he modulates anywhere, he immediately comes back to it. This slight menace of the drums, these somewhat painful harmonies, even in sections that didn't have them before. The image I have in my mind is of us finding refuge in this musical world of B flat major, but it is outside time. It is as if time has stopped and we can exist in this timeless space for as long as we want, but we cannot move from it unless we abandon it completely. So we cannot have a continuation of the story unless we decide to exit the refuge and submit ourselves to whatever dramatic forces Beethoven would like to show us. So a moment of perhaps of static tranquility, but not of true relaxation. And indeed, the finale seems to pick the narrative thread of the end of the first movement. So the F and the D will also be our opening motive. The finale is an incredibly strong narrative in itself, and of course in the way it connects to the main narrative of the sonata. It is a perpetuum mobile. It is written throughout in a flow of semiquavers, and it starts in almost a gentle way. It could be a folk tale, it could be a folk song. There's a definite sense of a tale being told, but it's a tale that we can listen to without really experiencing it ourselves. But Beethoven cures us of this delusion very quickly. From bar 30 or so, the world closes around us and we are thrust into the thick of action. If you think from a cinematographical point of view, the opening scene, we are far away and we can observe the action from a distance, or even just hearing someone tell us about that from a different point in time. But from that moment on, and almost without respite until the end of the movement, we are thrust into the thick of action. The camera puts us firmly inside the dramatic occurrence. And from there on, it's wave upon wave of sound. Almost with a manic insistence. And it doesn't let up, is what I wanted to say. Waves upon waves. And every time we think he would finish this, another wave comes. Times throughout the movement, the initial motive recurs, but it is always short-lived. This area of piano is very short, and we get very quickly to, once again, to the dramatic. We do not know really what the tale was that Beethoven was telling here. Even if we associate it with the Tempest, which scene in the Tempest was he trying to convey? But I think we all share the feeling of a narrative, and a very strong, imaginative, and quite sad and dark narrative being told. If I said there was no respite in the first movement, there is no respite here. There is no moment of a major key. And then a final outburst comes in the reprise, and in the coda we have a moment of build-up. But it's not respite, it's the same kind of expectant tension which we know will erupt. Erupt it does in a final outburst of emotion. And if before here he had this motive twice, so first time and the second time, here we have a third final fortissimo recurrence, like a desperate cry out of your heart. But interestingly, the last bars go completely back to the mood of the opening. peters out, it dissipates in the low part of the keyboard, as if in the end he does say, but actually this is just a tale and this is what happened, and the camera pulls back and we are once again in the framing, outer framing of the tale. But I think the emotional and psychological impact stays with us. And I think it's not by chance that out of the 3 sonatas so this is part of a trilogy, it's the middle sonata in the trilogy, and the other 2 sonatas in that trilogy are no less imaginative and no less inventive. And yet the perhaps stronger narrative magic of the D minor sonata of the Tempest was the one that made it so famous and was the one that stayed with us the longer and continues to move us and to touch us the longest. So perhaps the nickname was indeed fully deserved.